Hello, welcome to episode 20, that is 20, of Time of Death. I am Ris, half of your host, and
I'm Dee, the other half that makes the whole pumpkin pie.
Pumpkin.
Or pineapple.
Or papaya.
Or coconut.
Or pecan.
Or lime. Key lime.
Lime. This pie got Lyme disease. If you are new here, we are a podcast run by two registered nurses. And if you didn't know, we are sisters as well.
Unfortunately.
Okay, thank you, Dee. Rude. Very rude. Anyway, we like to talk about true crime cases and give our opinions and perspectives on them. We like to talk about true crime cases that either feature victims who are medical professionals, where the perpetrator is a medical professional, or just when they have a heavy medical influence. So today we're going to be talking about Cindy James. This is a popular case from what I discovered, but I hadn't heard of it before. This is an unsolved case.
Ooh. In a good way, like maybe we'll solve it. Not like.
Well, I think there are a lot of differing opinions on what truly happened. I don't want to ruin it from the beginning, but because you haven't heard of her.
I have not heard of Cindy James.
So then we're just going to delve right in. So this case takes place in Vancouver, Canada. Cindy James was born Cindy Hack to Otto. He's like a military man. He's in the Air Force, and her mom's name is Tilly. So they moved around a lot growing up, and Cindy had 5 siblings. When she was 6 years old, she started having nightmares. In their house, they had a basement like a lot of houses do, and she would be fearful of it. She said she would oftentimes have to eat in the dark basement because there wasn't enough room around their table, or she was sent there for punishment. Either way, she was fearful of basements from a young age. Eventually, she told her future husband out that she was sexually assaulted by her brother. Growing up, she always wanted to go to college, but her father was very much like, okay, only boys go to college.
Oh, God.
This is like in the 1960s. She was growing up in the like 1950s, 1960s eras. Her dad only agreed to her going to nursing school. So she ended up going to nursing school. In 1963, she met a resident doctor, and the two started dating while she was in nursing school. And he ended up dying unexpectedly. And so just to kind of cope with her loss, she started working really hard at school, and she especially excelled in psychiatric areas of nursing.
Okay, Cindy, we see you. You can join the club.
So eventually she becomes a pediatric mental health nurse.
Oh, wow.
Yep. Cindy had long blonde hair. She's very conventionally attractive, blue eyes. And in the 1960s, in 1965, she met her husband, Dr. Roy McPace, at Vancouver Hospital. He was 18 years older. He was a psychiatrist. The two of them got close after working in a group project for her nursing studies. And he was married at the time, but he ended up leaving his wife in December 1966. Cindy was 22 years old at this time, and the two of them got married right after his divorce. Roy got along really well with Otto and Tilly, her parents, and actually her dad was only 6 years older than Roy, so they became like buddies.
God.
They became buddies. They drank together. They played cards together. Very much buddies.
It's creepy.
Yeah.
Like, hey, I'm with your daughter. And like, how would you be okay with that as a parent?
I don't know.
But yes, I sound very judgy, but the whole thing is just like, you're married, you're older, you're like close to her dad's age. Like, it just is, you're a psychiatrist and you're dating this young hot nurse. Like, it just has, it's ick for me.
See, I don't really have a problem with the age gap, but my problem here is that he was married at the time, and he definitely had like a power dynamic in the relationship.
Yes, absolutely.
If there's a power dynamic, that's the issue I have with, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, so their first few years of marriage were happy. They were like in, that blissful area. And shortly after, Cindy started working at Children's Foundation. So here she's working with children who have endured some trauma. They have some mental health struggles going on. And she really enjoyed working with kids. She always wanted to do that. In 1974, she got a job at Blenheim House. She was actually the founding director there, and she worked with preschoolers who struggled with mental health issues.
Well, she probably could relate to these kids with mental health issues because of her own trauma.
Yeah, so she's definitely been through it. She's been through a lot, and that this will play a big role later on throughout the story. So she's working at Blenheim House. This is like her ideal job. She is described as being gentle and kind to the children she works with.
Good.
Just like a really passionate person. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, Roy was kind of struggling as a psychiatrist. So after he moved to British Columbia, he failed the accreditation process a couple times. So he wasn't able to work as a psychiatrist. So he started working at a electric services company as the head of medical services.
So at this time, she is the founding director of her facility, so maybe that caused a little resentment.
Yeah, so her career is blooming, and his career is kind of stagnant. He's not even working as a psychiatrist at this time. So he's just really cranky to Cindy, and I do agree with you. He's resentful of her success. I really enjoyed boating and being on the water, he's
a man's man.
He's a man's man. He's a sailor. Anyway, he's a sailor. So he bought a boat called the Peacemaker because their last name is Pacemaker.
With her money.
Oh, boy.
With her hard-earned money.
So he buys a boat called the Pacemaker. And, I'm sorry.
How to know you work in the medical field. He bought a boat and named it the Pacemaker. What the hell is going on here? Pacemaker. She's real steady. She never quits.
She's real steady. She reels you in.
Just don't throw her an MRI.
Oh, God. Oh, yeah.
The Pacemaker. What was I know that it had to be something else.
It's the Peacemaker. Because their last name is Makepeace, so Pacemaker.
I like that. I like that way better than the Peacemaker. That's way better than...
You can have a boat and name it the Pacemaker?
Yes! If my name especially was Maker Pace or whatever the heck it is, I would totally name my boat. I would name my dogs Pacemaker. I would name everything I could get my hands on Pacemaker. Or derivatives of that.
Trademark.
Yes.
Pacemaker.
I think it is too, is the fact that I have the sense of humor of a 5-year-old boy.
That's true.
But yeah, I think it's freaking hilarious.
I appreciate it. We have a similar sense of humor sometimes.
You know what I was also told? Is that we sound similar.
You and I?
Mm-hmm.
A little.
I think I have a much more seductive voice, but it's fine.
I do like your voice a lot.
I like your voice better.
No, I sound like a nasally baby.
No, you have a very assuring voice. Like if I was in crisis, your voice would be a good voice.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, so they're on the Pacemaker.
So he buys a boat called the Peacemaker.
Mm-hmm.
And, Cindy actually had a bad phobia of water. She would get really anxious whenever she was on water. But she would come once in a while because she knew it made Roy really happy. But Roy was kind of annoyed with her and her phobia.
What is little shitty husband? You're a literal psychologist. Oh, yeah, you have a phobia of water? That's a very common...
Yeah, I agree with you. That's weird. I didn't even think about that part. But yeah, he deals with people with these mental health
irrational
or these fears. Anyway, so Cindy, on the other hand, didn't really like water, but she really enjoyed gardening.
Hmm.
And here, when they're kind of having some struggles in their marriage, she would just garden as like a escape mechanism sometimes, but it was a very healthy way for her to deal with her issues.
Hmm.
Anyway, this is a long time coming, but 16 years after being married in July 1982, the two of them separate.
Hmm.
And Roy stayed in their main house, and Cindy started renting a place near her workplace. But the two of them kind of still went on dates once in a while,
Hmm.
and they were still friendly. They'd like go out for dinner. They were very amicable. So 3 months later, after their separation, Cindy started getting like these weird calls, and they'd occur throughout the week. Most of the time, they would just like hang up. Sometimes they threaten her, like, oh, you're going to die.
Hmm.
Or they like heavy breathe on the phone. Once in a while, they'll have like comments like with the sexual innuendo.
Was it a male voice, female voice, or what kind of voice was it?
Male voice, I think, typically.
Hmm.
So one night, she goes out with her friend Agnes. And Agnes keeps showing up in this story. She's married to a man named Tom, and the two of them are involved later on in the story. So she goes out with Agnes. The two of them come home. So Agnes is over her house, and Cindy kind of like goes on and does her own thing. She starts like preparing for bed, tidying up the house, that kind of stuff. And she goes into the bedroom, and Agnes hears her scream, and she had found slashes in her pillow. So they call the police. They come. One of the police officers, and I guess in Canada, they're called constables.
Mm-hmm.
So Constable Pat McBride comes to investigate, and they can't really find much, just a bunch of slashes in a pillow. Okay, but they think it's like from a razor.
Hmm.
So then Cindy calls Roy for some, just like to help her figure out what's going on. Like she's terrified. And Roy comes over. He comes to check everything out. And he tries to make her feel better. Of course, she's just very upset, understandably. So she had him take the pillow out when he left and just get rid of it.
Hmm.
Okay. The next day, the tenants below Cindy's apartment call the police. And this is while Cindy is at work. And they're like, I hear noises upstairs. Like, I know Cindy is at work. Like, can you come check it out? Because this is abnormal, like, especially with everything that's been going on with her. So they come to check it out. Found nothing wrong. There's no one in the apartment. They're like, okay, we'll just keep an eye on it. If anything changes, just call us back. Constable Pat, as we'll call him, a couple days after the pillow incident, he comes by Cindy's apartment to just check on her, and he also brings her some deadbolts to put on her door. Constable Pat had actually separated from his wife. So he's like, okay, well, I need a place to stay. And Cindy's like, well, I got all this room. You should just come in, move with me. Like, you can rent a room. Like, you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back, that kind of thing. So he rents a room in her apartment. He moves in on November 1st. And of course, they get along very well. Phone calls keep continuing. And on November 22nd, Cindy was going to her car after she got out of work, and she found a picture from a magazine of a woman who looked similar to her, and her eyes were scratched out, like with either like a razor or like a coin, something like that. So Cindy was like, uh-oh, they know where I work. I'm scared, even more scared now.
But this person sounds very organized.
Mm-hmm.
He knows where she lives. He was able to get into the apartment without breaking into it.
Mm-hmm.
He has to know her.
Mm.
And, it's something he obviously has a lot of resentment to be slashing these pillows and carving the eyes out. He has a lot of feelings that you oftentimes would not have with a stranger.
Yeah, it's true. So after this, she finds this magazine. The patrol cars start circling by Cindy's house even more frequently. And less than a week later, on November 28th, Pat was working, but he stopped home to check on Cindy and have a coffee and just check in with her. And he left, and then right after leaving, he got a phone call. And the phone call said that Cindy's phone lines had been cut, and the phone line to the downstairs tenant was intact, but all the other phone lines were cut off.
Mm.
And Cindy said she received a hang up call, so just a call where they just hung up about a half hour before the lines went dead.
So someone had to have physically cut them in the apartment.
Yeah. So Pat and his partner kept an eye on her house, but nothing else happened that day. So time keeps going on. Pat's looking into everything still. Some weird things come up where a female neighbor complained getting calls where they would just hang up.
Mm.
And then another neighbor said that he saw a strange man walking around the neighborhood. Okay. In early December 1982, so Pat moves out. So he stayed with her for about a month. And the two of them had gotten closer and started dating while they were living together. So they would actually go on double dates with Roy and another female friend. But they all got along well.
Was Roy dating that female friend?
I didn't see anything specifying that, but they would double date. So that same month, one night, police noticed that Roy's car was just chilling around Cindy's block, and it went in the street behind her house, and he just shut the lights off on the car. So police are like, what's going on there? And they go and ask him why he's there, and he tells them he's there to protect his wife. And police tell him, dude, you gotta go. And Cindy ends up telling Pat that she heard tapping on her window one night, and she was awoken by this. And she had found that Roy there with a knife and a rifle, and he was there to protect her. He's like, you're good, you can sleep. Dee.
I tell you, that would definitely not be my first reaction. Oh, yes, thanks, babe. I'll definitely sleep fine.
Thank you.
Did anything happen that night?
No, not that night that I saw recorded. But the next day, after Roy had tapped on her window, Roy ends up telling Cindy that he thought someone in the mafia was after her. And he's like, okay, these crimes, you keep getting these phone calls, you have a slash pillow. This reminds me a lot of what happened in The Godfather.
Stop.
So he's like, okay, maybe you angered one of your patient's family members and now they're trying to get you. This is their revenge. And he's like, just come move back in with me. Dee.
Come back, babe.
He's like,
I'll protect you. He's literally trying to force her back into his arms.
But also, I think he actually is very fearful. He actually believes it's the mafia after his wife.
But he's a psychiatrist. Does he realize how irrational he sounds?
So on January 15th, Constable Pat was visiting Cindy, and he was there when she got a phone call. And she heard a woman's voice on the PA system. And it was kind of like what you would hear an airport. So they were able to do a partial trace and show that it was coming from the Vancouver airport.
Mm.
On January 27th, Cindy was actually very nervous this night. She was very anxious. And Agnes was like, okay, let me just come over. I'll spend the night. I'll be there with you so you don't have to be alone. And Cindy agreed. She was really grateful. She's like, yes, come on over. And while she was waiting, Cindy decided to move some boxes into her garage. So Cindy tries turning the light on, but it wasn't working. So she's in the garage at this point, tries turning the garage light on, no go. And Cindy remembers that someone grabbed her right arm, told her to be quiet. She tried fighting back a little bit. He injected her right shoulder, so probably an IM injection, intramuscular injection, drugging her. And then the man said he was going to cut her face with a knife if she screamed. And Cindy said she felt something tight wrapped around her neck. And she said it was too dark for her to make out any real identifying features of his face. but she did see he was wearing gloves and he had running shoes on. But Cindy was, of course, being strangled. She couldn't really breathe, and the man left after telling Cindy it will take a long time to die. So Agnes gets there and she hears moaning in the garage, and she finds Cindy with a black stocking tied around her neck and cuts all over her body. So Agnes calls 911. Cindy was taken to the ER. She had sustained 14 cuts to her back, shoulders, and legs. These cuts were really exact, so the treatment team was like, okay, this looks like they were inflicted by like a scalpel or like a razor or something like that. She also had bruising to her face. She also had a puncture mark on her right arm where she was injected. And then she also had ligature marks around her neck from the strangulation.
Do you know what they injected her with?
During this time, they don't do a toxicology screening from what I see.
But it would have to be someone with a medical background in order to administer an IM correctly.
Probably.
You know?
Yeah. So Cindy's recollection of events was really foggy. Roy was the primary suspect, of course, but he had an alibi, and he worked until 9 p.m. Then he got dinner. Then he was home at 10 p.m. He agreed to take a polygraph test, but he was being treated for a cardiac condition, and he was on medications.
Beta blocker.
Yeah, so I'm thinking like metoprolol or something like that. For those of you who don't know, beta blockers treat high blood pressure or high heart rate. Sometimes it's used for anxiety, and it helps stabilize your heart rate and bring your blood pressure down. So they're like, okay, that would interfere if he took a polygraph test. So he never ended up getting a polygraph. After this, Cindy, of course, was shocked and terrified. Cindy wanted to move, so she ended up moving to a bungalow. And she really wanted a garden, so a lot of her friends and family were like, okay, why don't you move into like an apartment building? Like there's more security. And she was like, no, I want my own place. I want to be with my garden. So she also she was a very private person. She really did not like to share much about the crimes going on to family and friends. Cindy started seeing Dr. Connolly. He is a general practitioner. He is not a psychiatrist. She didn't want to see a psychiatrist.
Understandably.
There's a lot of stigma attached to especially nurses and other medical professionals who look for psychiatric help, unfortunately.
And her ex-husband is a psychiatrist.
Yeah.
You know? I could understand her not wanting to see a psychiatrist after, I'm sure she's suspicious that he's the one who's doing all this.
So her and Dr. Connolly start having their visits, and they start growing closer as well. They become friends. He prescribes her anxiety meds, sleep meds. So time goes on. Cindy starts receiving letters at work, and all these letters are from like magazine cutout letters where they spell out warnings like soon, Cindy, or you're dead, or stuff like that. But she was very shaken. About 9 months after the garage incident, on October 15th, 1983, Cindy reported hearing her dog, whose name is Heidi, barking. So she goes outside and she finds a dead cat in her yard with a note saying, "You're next." A month later, in November, Cindy hired a private investigator named Ozzy. And Cindy was really frustrated that the police department wasn't really getting anywhere. Ozzy gave her like a two-way radio to use, and there was a button attached that she could just press as like a panic button. So time goes on again. Hang-up calls are still going on. She's becoming increasingly like self-isolated, frightened. She's withdrawing herself. Soon after, Cindy finds her garden wrecked. The plants are all dug up. It's like someone just went in there, stomped around, messed it all up. And Cindy said that Roy had done a similar thing when they were together. So staff at her workplace were getting really suspicious of Roy. They said in 1981, Cindy had come in. She had a leg injury. And she said, oh, I heard it while playing racquetball. But she told one of the speech language pathologists that Roy had actually pushed her down the stairs.
Mm.
Another thing is in Christmas 1981, she had a black eye, and staff saw Roy hugging Cindy in her office and telling her, like, I'm sorry I did that to you. Also, Cindy told a staff member that she needed reconstructive breast surgery after an assault in 1982. Cindy had a black eye again and told staff finally they were separating. Cindy denied that Roy was the one attacking her, and she ended up breaking up with Pat as well. She's like, this is too much for me right now. I can't do a romantic relationship. On January 30th, Ozzy was notified that a rustling sound was heard on the radio. So he goes to her house. He's knocking on her door. There's no answer at the door. He peeps through the window. He sees Cindy laying on the ground
Oh, no.
in the hallway of her house. So he goes, he calls the police, and then he knocks the door down, and he finds Cindy. She's breathing, but she's unconscious. She's got a bump on her head. Her left arm is outstretched, and
Got her again.
a knife was like pierced through the skin of her hand, holding a note in place into the floor. It said, now you must die. A black sock was tied tightly around her neck as well. And of course, Cindy is not really sure what happened. Again, she said that she does remember seeing a man coming through the side gate of her house, and Cindy thought it was a neighbor. So she calls out to him, and he doesn't answer her. He just like really quickly walks right up to her, and she's terrified. The man hits her on the head, and she doesn't remember much other than that she woke up on the kitchen floor, and the two men were in there with her. And after they had left, Cindy remembered that she crawled to the hallway to retrieve the radio and tried to contact Ozzy. And Cindy describes her main attacker to Ozzy, and she says that he had a brown mustache, blue eyes, and was wearing like a blue nylon jacket. But she didn't tell the police any of this because he threatened to kill her sisters if she did. So she only ended up giving them like basic info. 2 weeks later, on February 14th, Roy was questioned about the incident. And detectives are like, okay, man, we are convinced you did this. They're interrogating him for like 6 hours to get him to confess to the crimes, but he is adamant, I did not do this. And they end up telling Roy that Cindy had finally said that she thought he was behind the attacks and that she was scared of him and that he was violent. And Roy is like kind of thrown off. He's like, I definitely did not do these crimes, but he did admit to slapping Cindy in the face on 2 separate occasions in the past, but he's adamant like he's never done more than that. And Roy again tells the police like, dude, I know the mafia are after her. Okay. So, with no evidence to charge him, Roy left. So Cindy, she's like, okay, I'm all worked up. I need to wind down again. Let me visit my parents on Vancouver Island. So she goes, visits them, spends some time with her parents, and she comes back and she's in good spirits. She's feeling better. And Cindy and Ozzy start putting a better plan in place. Cindy's like, okay, every time I leave, I'm going to call you, Ozzy, and I'm going to let you know that I'm leaving. And then when I come back, I'm going to let you know I'm home. Ozzy's like, okay, perfect. That works fine. So on July 23rd, this is around like 8 p.m., Cindy calls Ozzy's phone to let him know she was taking Heidi for a walk nearby her house and that she'd be back in like an hour. So Cindy ends up watching some people playing tennis, and she says a green van pulled up next to her, and a man with long dark hair and a beard wearing glasses, and then a blonde woman were in the car. And she says he rolled the passenger window down and he asks her how to get to Churchill Street. So Cindy's like, okay, that's fine. Like, I'll give you directions. She starts giving them directions. 3 hours after, a man named Reagan hears a strange noise coming from the outside of his house. And he looks out, he sees this blonde lady at his front door, and she's trying to get into his house. And he sees her mouth some words to him, and she points at her neck. And of course, there's a black stocking around her neck.
And this is the third time that there was a black stocking.
And it won't be the last. So, Reagan goes outside, and he says he had a lot of trouble cutting it off because the stocking was so tight around her neck. So she's like almost unconscious at this point. He's trying to get it off. Eventually he does, but he can't even like fit his hand in there or his fingers in there, so he's struggling. So he calls 911, and Cindy is brought to the hospital, to the ER. And her left nostril was bloody. She had some pain to her right ankle. Ozzy had actually come to see Cindy when she was at Reagan's home. And he tells the doctors that there's 2 fresh puncture marks indicating that something was injected to her inner arm.
And that could be self-inflicted.
It could be, potentially. So this time toxicology screens were done. Cindy was positive for benzodiazepines. And nurses end up finding like twigs and leaves in her underwear, kind of saying, okay, maybe there's some like sexual assault going on here, you know what I mean? So Cindy, again, can't remember much, just recalls meeting the 2 people in the van and giving them directions. That's it. So police start looking at the park where Cindy was taken, and they found one of her shoes. She carried around some like dog repellent to protect herself. And there's also like a drag mark in the dirt, like indicating that a body had been dragged near the sidewalk where the van pulled. So in the ER, one of the clerks, her name's Lisa, she receives a weird call in which a man asks about what kind of security they have in the ER. And Lisa's like, what do you mean? Like, what kind of security? And he's like, do you have security guards in the hospital? And he was also asking, like, what time does the ER close? How many floors are there? Like, all these weird questions. Lisa was weirded out, and she wanted to transfer him to her supervisor, but he was just hung up and was like, okay, no, I'm hanging up. Lisa tells the police this, and she also mentioned that he had an accent, which sounded like kind of like a South African or maybe a New Zealand accent. So after this, Cindy started undergoing hypnosis sessions.
Listen, if nothing else sticks,
Yeah.
try a little hypnosis, man. What the hell is going on here?
It gets so much more. There's so much information in this case.
This is like, yes, you're being stalked. Yes. Let's do some hypnosis therapy.
So after this, Cindy starts doing hypnosis sessions, and they're able to find out some information. She tells them like the model of the van, including details about characteristics about the van.
Mm-hmm.
So she says she was taken into the van, and the back of the van is carpeted. There were several people there, and one person was wearing a mask, and she was injected with something. So she remembers one of these people saying, oh my gosh, in a strong South African accent. So Cindy knows that this is a Zulu word meaning like, obey me, like, listen to me, I'm warning you, that kind of thing. So October 2nd, at another session, Cindy remembers a trip she took with Roy while they were on the Peacemaker in 1981 in July. So they're sailing around, they're sailing to the Gulf Islands, and Cindy said eventually they had docked, and Cindy actually had stayed in the compartment below the deck where she took a nap. And Roy kind of just went off, did his own thing. He was exploring the property there. Cindy remembers she hears some shouting, so she remembers she got dressed, she went out on the deck, didn't see anybody, and so she ventures off and she gets to a log cabin. So this log cabin is at the top of a hill. She goes inside to investigate it. So she slowly knocks on the door. No answer, of course, so she slowly opens the door, and she sees Roy. He's standing there, and he appears very angry. He's holding a bloody knife, 2 bodies are lying on the floor, a man and a woman. So Cindy's shocked, she says, and she starts running. She runs out of the cabin, and Cindy ends up screaming to Roy and calling him a murderer. She ends up vomiting, and Roy gets to her and slaps her. And Cindy says, like, her memory again is very hazy, and she recalls sitting on a bed. Roy chopped their bodies up with an axe to prepare before throwing them into the ocean. So she tells detectives, detectives find out and they try looking for this cabin, but she wasn't really able to give them too much information about it. And they search the general area, but of course can't find any place that matches this description. After this hypnosis session, Cindy actually ends up calling her husband while working with detectives, and they use a tapped phone to just see if he can, like, slip up and give them some information about these murders. So this is on July 2nd, 1985. And he was like, okay, I don't know why this woman is calling me. Like, she's blaming me for the attacks. Like, I haven't heard from her. She ends up telling him, Roy, you know, I've been doing some hypnosis sessions, and like, I wanted to come to you about that night in the cabin 4 years ago before I go to the police. And Roy is shocked. He's like, what are you talking about? I don't know what you're talking about. Cindy tells him, I know it's you doing these attacks to me, and he denies it adamantly. She hangs up, and that's that. After this, Cindy and Roy both were placed on like round-the-clock surveillance, but this didn't last very long. On December 11th, so this is like 6 months later, Cindy leaves work on her lunch break, and she doesn't come back. A woman named Desiree was riding her bike near the University of British Columbia when Desiree notices a blonde woman, and she's just like stumbling across the road. She falls into a ditch. And this is on the other side of the street. So Desiree is like, oh my God, runs over, finds a black stocking around her neck. She removes it. She calls EMS. Medics find her. She is taken to the ER, evaluated. She has scratches on her chest, her arms, her legs, her back. She also had a bruise to her forehead, and she also had a puncture wound to her right inner arm. So, of course, they do tox screens again, and she's positive for benzodiazepines again, but Cindy also tells the doctor she had taken 6 milligrams Ativan for anxiety earlier that day.
I'm gonna just throw this out here. If she's really being drugged, it would have been harder to access a benzo versus a different, like an antipsychotic of some kind.
That's true. Anyway, so again, Cindy can't remember much. She remembers just leaving work to get lunch. She remembers stopping by the pharmacy to get some meds. And she just has this like vague recollection that she was in a room with her hands tied behind her back, but that's it. So Cindy ends up returning to work soon after this event, but she is growing more and more isolated. She is described as looking like really exhausted and just not doing well. She ends up moving yet again, this time to Richmond. She rents a house again with a garden. On April 12th, 1986, her friends Tom and Agnes, so this is Agnes's husband, they come over, they play card games, and they end up staying over. So they go to bed around 11 p.m. And around 2 a.m., Tom wakes up and he hears a thump downstairs in the level below him. So he gets dressed and Cindy knocks on his door. And she's like, okay, I heard the thump too. Can you come with me? I want to see what's happening. So Tom is able to see flames from the basement, and he yells for Agnes to call emergency services. And Agnes tries, but she can't because the phone line was dead. So Tom runs outside and sees a man in his 30s nearby Cindy's house, and he tells him to call 911. Or I don't think it's 911 Canada, but he tells this guy, like, call emergency services, like, we need help, there's a fire. And he doesn't answer. He just starts running. Firefighters come, and the fire's extinguished before 3 a.m. And the fire was just like confined to the basement. It really wasn't that bad. Everyone was safe and unharmed. Um, and they're looking into it, but they can't figure out what's going on. And again, Cindy says, okay, this is Roy. Cindy is just growing more and more depressed. She's getting more withdrawn. She ends up actually having a stint at St. Paul's psychiatric unit. So she stays there for a little bit. Her mental health is getting better. She eventually is discharged. And she divorces Roy in June 1986. She changes her last name from Makepeace to James. And she changed it to James instead of Hack, her maiden name, because she was like, okay, this is like a symbol of a new beginning. Let me just choose James because it's nice, short, and sweet. Like, I just want to be over with my past. So that same summer, she's already on a 6-month sick leave, and she ends up going to Germany. She's going to spend some time with her brother who lives there. His name is Roger. And she comes back and she's feeling better. She's feeling refreshed. She's ready to return to work. But they're like, I'm sorry, like, you need to resign. You aren't really able to handle your duties. Like, your work has been really struggling. But we are going to give you a payout, and we will also pay for you to like undergo new training so you can start working as a hospital nurse. So she starts working at Richmond General Hospital. She's working on a medical floor. She's working like 12-hour shifts. It's really throwing her off even more. And she's struggling with worsened difficulty sleeping, and she starts taking anxiety meds more often. She's losing a lot of weight. She has been like writing in her journal throughout during all these crimes and in her stay at the psychiatric unit. And she's just really frustrated with everybody. She's frustrated with the police for not doing their job. She's frustrated with these crimes that keep on continuing no matter what she does. She's just voicing like, I am just getting so fed up with everything.
Understandably.
Yeah. So one day on October 9th, 1988, Roy is just sitting in his apartment, and there's 2 men that approach the main entrance, and they ring the intercom. And Roy does not recognize them. So he just let it be. And then a few minutes later, he actually heard noises at his apartment door, and he hears their voices. And he's like, okay, it's probably those 2 men. He was a little spooked. And then a few days later, Roy was checking his answering machine when he heard a 12-second message. And in this message, it was like this creepy, low voice saying, Sunday, dead meat soon. And Roy was, of course, shocked. He's scared. He's thinking it's those 2 men who were at his door. So he replays it again. He realizes that the caller isn't saying Sunday, he's saying Cindy. And then he had 1 or 2 other similar voicemails as well. So Roy is like, I think I'm being framed. He tells his lawyer that he's getting these weird calls. So the lawyer's like, forward the tapes to the police, but Roy didn't want to because they're like, I really don't trust them at this point. They've been after me about Cindy like this whole time. I'm not going to. So he doesn't mention the calls to anybody, including Cindy. So later that month, Cindy is finishing work, and she gets off at 8:30. She comes home, and she had gotten into the habit of waiting in the garage with the lights off on the car off. Like, she's just making sure everything's okay before she goes inside the house. So she does that. She waits for a little bit, and then she says she was getting out of the car to go inside when she saw a man behind her car. And he's wearing a ski mask. He grabs her, puts a knife to her neck, and then Cindy says she notices a second man wearing a ski mask. And Cindy initially tries to fight back, but she was injected with another sedative. So the alarm given to her by Ozzy went off 2 hours later, and police responded, and they find Cindy lying in the driver's seat, and she's naked from the waist down. Her tights were pulled down around her ankles. Legs were like sticking outside the car door. Her hands had been like tied behind her back with a stocking, a black stocking. Another black stocking was tied around her neck, and in one of her hands was like the alarm device that she had, and her mouth was covered with duct tape. Blood was around her nostrils, and the police officer could not find a pulse. She was cold to touch. He's like, okay, she's dead. I can't find a pulse. Like, she's, I think, been dead for a little while. So he calls for backup. He's like, I got a dead body. And another officer comes, and he actually heard some breathing.
Mm-hmm.
So they're like, okay, let's move. Let's get all these ties off her. So they remove all the ties. She goes to the ER. She ends up spending time in the ICU where she was in a coma. And eventually she was transferred to a second hospital. And at the second hospital, she ends up intubated, and they're doing a bunch of brain scans. The neurologist was concerned, and that's why he transferred her. So they're doing a bunch of brain scans. Everything looks good on the brain scans. She eventually is getting better. And as soon as she's able to, the police start questioning her about this crime. So Cindy's getting better. She's eventually discharged. At this point, detectives are like, okay, there is a pattern in Cindy's cases. Like, she will have periods where it's smooth sailing, like nothing's happening. And then the phone calls and threatening letters would start up again. And then Cindy would like know that something bad was going to happen. And then, an attack would happen, and then they'd stop for a little bit. Okay, so on April 3rd, 1989, the police started installing surveillance at Cindy's house.
Mm-hmm. Which they should have done.
So they're installing these cameras, and there is a lot of issues with equipment and technical problems, but they're like, okay, but we have surveillance up. Like, this has a pattern. Like, we're eventually going to catch this person or people. On May 25th of that same year, Cindy goes out for coffee with a nursing friend. Her name is Diane Young. She was in good spirits that day. She was really happy. And Cindy ends up telling Diane how the attacks against her seemed to have quieted down, and she's feeling more hopeful. And then after that, Cindy goes to pick up her paycheck, and she talks to the payroll person. Her name is Tammy. And she said, oh, I've got 4 days off. I'm planning all these different things. I'm going to a birthday party. She's excited. And Tammy mentioned oh, you look really beautiful today. She had a pink blouse on, she had burgundy pants on, and she had a blue suede jacket on. And Cindy says, oh, well, I just had a makeover at a beauty salon. And Tammy says how Cindy wasn't that full of life in a really long time. At 9 p.m., Tom and Agnes stopped by Cindy's house. They had made plans to play bridge that night. So only a couple hours. They had spoken with Cindy and said, all right, we'll be there to play bridge. And they were surprised and worried when Cindy's car was not there.
Also a pattern. Something seems to always happen when she's with her couple friends.
Mm-hmm.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. So, Agnes and Tom end up driving around Richmond, and they are looking for Cindy's car. And they end up seeing her blue Chevrolet, and it's parked in the Blundell Shopping Center. And it's nearby the Bank of Montreal. They go over to the vehicle, and it was locked. There was a small trickle of blood that was on the side of the driver's door. Police were called, and they came and investigated the car, and they found 2 Safeway bags that held groceries in the front passenger seat, and Cindy's purse was between the bags. 2 grocery bags were found in the floor of the passenger seat, and then in the back seat there were 2 bags, and one had a croquet cassette and then some wrapping paper as well. Under Cindy's car, police found her bank card and there was like an ATM receipt around it. And it showed that Cindy had deposited her paycheck at 7:58 that night. The position of Cindy's car made Agnes more concerned because she typically would park as close to the ATM machine as she could. She was very cautious, and she said that Cindy would have waited for a closer car to leave so that she could take that spot. Like, she wasn't in a rush. If she had to park far away, she would wait. At 3:16, two police officers get to Roy's house to question him. And Roy, at first, is refusing to let them in. He's scared. He just, does not want to deal with it. Finally, he let them in. And they were like, okay, why are you giving us such a hard time to let us in? And he's like, I'm just scared. And he tells them that he's been sleeping with a rifle next to his bed because he had been getting, hang-up calls and all these phone messages he tells them about. So he's like, I keep getting these messages, and the officers are kind of looking around his apartment, and they're seeing that, okay, his bed looks like it was slept in, and also Roy gives an alibi for the night before, and he says he was, biking to a market with a friend, and the police officers end up telling Roy about her disappearance, and he starts tearing up, and he whispers, my God, she's dead. The police start putting legs out, and there's no sign of Cindy anywhere. They did do forensic testing on her car, but only Cindy's fingerprints were found.
Convenient.
The blood on her door did match her blood type, and the police were able to pull up the Bank of Montreal records to show which customers used the ATM machine 15 minutes before and then 15 minutes after Cindy.
Mm-hmm.
So a man named Barry Leroy, he's used the machine 3 minutes after Cindy, and he tells them, well, I just saw this blonde lady. She looked, I guess, like Cindy, but I can't tell you for sure. And she was walking in front of my car in a diagonal direction across the parking lot. And she was walking away from the shopping center. He said she was the only person I saw in the parking lot that night, but they showed him a photo and he couldn't give a 100% positive ID. So the search is continuing. Everyone's looking for Cindy, and Cindy's dad, Otto, he travels to Richmond, and he ends up staying in Cindy's house to help with the investigation. 5 days go by, still no Cindy anywhere. Everyone is just so confused about where she went. There's no trace of her, no spottings of her anywhere. Otto ends up telling the police that before she disappeared, she had called a friend, and Cindy had said to her friend, some people might think I'm paranoid, but I have a feeling I've been followed all week. And this was so different than what she mentioned to her nursing friend, Diane, and Tammy. That day when she went missing, she was very hopeful. You know what I mean? It was really bizarre how she would say, oh, I've been followed all week. I can't shake this feeling. And everyone was saying, everyone else that saw her that day was okay, she's so happy. She's hopeful. This is just isn't in line with what other people heard and saw from her. So police end up searching Cindy's house, and they find 4 bottles of prescription sedatives, and they find 9 bottles of an over-the-counter sedative. They also found another 19 bottles of prescription meds hidden in her home, and they end up making an entire list of all the drugs, and there were over 900 pills in her house. So they're okay, she is, I think, hoarding these meds. This is a little weird.
Because it was weird that her IMs would be benzos.
Mm-hmm.
Very weird.
Yeah. So, but the thing is, if they She doesn't even have to do. All she has to do is a puncture wound because she's already got benzos in her system. Like, she could just take a pill form and then, like, needle stick
That's gonna be
herself.
positive.
You know what I mean?
That's a good point, Ris.
Her family also ends up finding a kit. And this kit contained a needle and a syringe and a IV catheter and some saline in a spare room in her house. So this is also fishy considering how many puncture wounds she's had from all these injuries, or from all these assaults. On June 8th, 1989, this was 2 weeks after Cindy's disappearance, less than a mile from the Blundell shopping center, there was a construction crew repairing some pavement, and at around 10 a.m., one of these workers had to pee. So he goes to an abandoned house behind where they were working, and he goes into the lawn behind the house, and out of the corner of his eye, he sees this pink blouse and blonde hair. So he's thinking, okay, maybe she's sleeping, but he goes closer to examine what's going on. So he sees that she's lying on the right side, and she's kind of partially laying on a blue suede jacket, and she's got burgundy pants on, and she is dead, and she has been dead for a while. Her wrists and ankles were tied behind her back, and around her neck was a black stocking. Police were called. It was a positive ID for Cindy. Nobody saw anything. Police were interviewing people around the area. Locals said, we have not seen anything suspicious in the last 2 weeks, but they did say, a squatter was living in a van behind the lot, very close to where Cindy's body was. The squatter was interviewed. He denied saying anything weird in the past 2 weeks. Initially, investigators were thinking it was going to be, the cause of death was going to be a strangulation. But there was an autopsy done, and
let me guess.
What do you think?
Benzo OD.
So there were no injuries consistent with strangulation. They did a tox screening. It showed that Cindy had 8 different drugs in her body, including flurazepam, diazepam, and morphine. So her cause of death was a drug overdose. A month after her body was found, Otto and Tilly and some of Cindy's siblings met with the police. Police told them that they were not investigating Cindy's murder anymore because they thought that her death was a suicide. Over the past 6 years, Cindy had made almost 100 reports to the police. These reports varied from hang-up calls, letters, vandalized property, physical assault, fires, and actually dead cats were brought to her 3 times. People were really starting to suspect that Cindy was the person behind these attacks. Cindy's friends and family were like, okay, there's no way she's been a victim of this stalker. She's been terrorized by this stalker. There were some detectives that came forward to give their input. One of these officers was one of the first to arrive at Cindy's house on January 27th, 1983. So back 6 years ago, after that first physical attack, when she was found in the garage. Mm-hmm. He said that the garage light was working, and Cindy claimed it was not, but it was working, and he had checked it that day. There was also no indication of a struggle. The boxes that Cindy said she'd been moving were in a corner of the room. The only visible sign that an attack had happened was a bit of blood on one of the boxes. It looked like a smudged thumbprint. He also noted that there was fresh blood on the bathroom counter and the mirror as well. And he said, Cindy had never mentioned anything going on in the bathroom.
Hmm.
And he thought that was really suspicious. And Cindy, because of this, they wanted to do a polygraph for her, and Cindy agreed to take it. She was asked during the polygraph if she had done the cuts to herself and tied the nylon stocking around her own neck on the night of the attack. And Cindy said, "No, I did not." And the polygraph indicated that she was lying.
Mm-hmm.
The test was actually repeated another day, and Cindy failed again. One of the detectives said that even though she failed these 2 polygraphs, they're like, Cindy is so anxious, she's so emotional, she's so exhausted. Like, these polygraphs aren't really accurate because of her emotional distress that she's going through. So after the polygraph test, she actually changed her version of that night. And she ends up telling the detective that the attack had occurred inside, not in the garage. And she said she had been too scared to tell them that this had happened because the attacker had threatened to kill her family. Or another police officer said that he had gone to the emergency call that Ozzy made that night when he looked into the window and saw her hand
On the ground.
stabbed through with a paring knife. And he said that there was blood on the kitchen floor where Cindy claimed the attack had initially happened, and it was smeared as though someone had tried to clean it up. One of the detectives, name's Gary, he said that he went to one of the arson attacks.
Mm-hmm.
So there was more than one. The fire had been extinguished, and so him and another detective went looking in the basement for evidence. And I guess in the basement, the window was broken up into 3 panes of glass, and the window opened outwards. So it would have been very difficult for someone to crawl through. And they were also covered in a lot of dust and cobwebs. And all of these dusts and cobwebs were intact. So they're like, okay, there's no way they came in this way. They also would have had a lot of fingerprints if they had gone in that way. And they never could find any fingerprints, just like in any of the other attacks or arson incidents. There was evidence showing that a fire had been lit in 6 different places from inside. A detective, Carol Halliday, she had come on after the investigation, after this arson attack. And as soon as she met Cindy, she was like, okay, something's up with Cindy. I don't trust her. I think she's doing all of this. So she was like, okay, these male police officers are seeing this.
Beautiful damsel in distress.
Yeah, so they're seeing a damsel in distress.
Mm-hmm.
She actually wanted to have Cindy charged with public mischief and arson, but her superiors were like, no, this would harm her mental health.
That's why they didn't charge her?
Yeah.
That's wild.
So on April 19th, 1986, that's that night when Tom and Agnes spent the night when the arson attack occurred. And investigators said that, the fire had started in the early hours of the morning, but Cindy's bed was made. It didn't appear to have been slept in at all. Roy was made out to be the primary suspect throughout the whole thing. So actually, Roy had been in South Africa one of the nights when the arson attacks occurred. And so eventually Roy testifies, and he is asked about that story about the cabin murders. It turns out Cindy never mentioned that her sister Melanie was also there and had witnessed no murders or nothing suspicious at all. They bring up the breast surgery that she had done, the reconstructive breast surgery, and he goes,
It was probably elective.
and he tells them, no, she had an elective breast augmentation.
How did I I might just calling it
Yeah.
left and right and then in the middle.
You are. Roy is just he's very distressed about this whole case as well. Like this, and he still cares about Cindy. He said like he was concerned with her, especially because she like was a very soft-spoken and quiet person who would like bottle things up a lot. He did find some things weird, like Cindy like kept destroying evidence of her attacks, like the time she had Roy throw out the pillow. You remember that?
Mm-hmm.
And then also he said one night him and Cindy came back to her house and there were 2 floodlights that were assembled above the ground that had been like unscrewed and smashed. And Roy said, you know, Cindy, you should really save those. Like maybe there's fingerprints. But she was adamant, no, I do not want them here. Like I'm just going to throw them out. I don't want to deal with it. So Roy is South African and he talks about the word hamagosh that she heard her kidnappers say. And he said that it was actually like this other Zulu term that meant farewell, take care. And he said, oh, like my sister used to say this word oftentimes with Cindy. And Roy said that's probably like where she got it from. Roy also, like in hindsight, remembers when Cindy read him this letter that she said she got from her mom. And it was a kind of like an angry letter. And it focused on Cindy's decision to marry a divorced man like Roy. And Roy was upset. He asked later to look at the letter and found out that Cindy actually had written it herself. So Roy, looking back, was like, okay, that was maybe an indication that something was off there. And he like made a diagnosis, if you will, that Cindy had like dissociative identity disorder.
No.
So he said that Cindy had always had trouble remembering her past, and he also said like she had like a childlike side to her, and he also referenced a lot of the trauma she went through was contributing to this diagnosis. And he also was very critical of the medical care that Cindy had gotten throughout these attacks. He also brought up how the black stockings used to strangle herself had like a symbolic undertone because of her sexual abuse she endured as a child. One of her brothers denied adamantly he had ever sexually assaulted Cindy. So the phone messages to Roy's phone were played, and there is a lot of speculation that it's actually a woman's voice trying to sound like a man. And I listened to it and it sounds, I agree. When I heard it, I was like, oh, that's a woman. It's like, Sunday. Hold on. Let me remember what it said.
This is a blind reaction.
Sunday, dead meat soon. That's what it sounded like.
It should have been dead meat soup.
Or Sunday, dead meat soon. Like, I think it was a woman doing those voices. There was also a like linguistics center in New York that analyzed the voicemails, and they found like very obvious similarities in some of the characteristics between the recordings on the voicemails and like audio content of Cindy's voice. Another part that pointed at Cindy's role in all these attacks was that the day of her disappearance, she was so joyful and so full of life. And there's argument that it's because she had this plan to finally commit suicide.
That happens all the time.
Usually people like get a burst of energy, like depressed people, suicidal people get a burst of energy when they're planning their suicide. But there was no receipt with the grocery bags. So detectives went to the shop and they like reran the purchases through, and none of like the records for the day at the store matched up with like the value of her items that she bought.
Hmm.
So that was a little suspicious. Detectives also, I don't know how they really knew this, but they said that Cindy likely had also purchased a pair of stockings and some other items and had taken them out of the bag. There was also suspicion that that bank card and the receipt appeared to like just have been placed carefully under the car instead of like thrown in like a struggle, because it was neat. It was so neat, like it was suspicious.
Yeah, it was too plan laid too well.
If you're like following this line of thinking where you believe she committed suicide, the thought pattern here is that she left the parking lot and took a bunch of flurazepam and morphine tablets. So she took these both by mouth, and then she had like 20 minutes to get to the lot, less than a mile away, before the drugs would have made her pass out. There was like residue in her stomach lining showing that the flurazepam was taken orally. And also they're thinking she did take the morphine orally because if she had taken it IV, she would have been knocked out. You know what I mean? And again, she did have a puncture mark from a needle. But, there's no real explanation for how Cindy had these drugs. There were no missing drugs from the hospital that she worked at. And police were thinking that, the puncture mark on her arm was self-inflicted, and they thought she took the blood from herself to smear on the door of her car.
I want to throw this out there. Maybe she was buying her drugs.
Maybe, it's possible.
And that could explain the people that incidentally were found hanging around.
That's true. That's true. So police are thinking that, she walked to the abandoned lot, she laid down, she hogtied herself up, and then she passed out.
That's hard to hogtie yourself, though.
So we'll get into that. There is like this knot tying expert guy who showed that it was possible to tie the knot that Cindy used, and he was able to tie it in 3 minutes. And he said that the stocking was found loosely enough around her wrists and ankles that it could be like slipped on and off. And the knots that she was using were the same ones that she used to tie her shoes. Family of Cindy and her friends were just so angry that there was so much insinuation that Cindy had done all of this to herself. But also there's parts here that you can't really explain easily. So how do you explain these people lurking around the neighborhood that friends and Roy had seen? Or like the neighbor we know mentioned how she was getting hang-up calls, and another neighbor saw people around the neighborhood. Tom saw that man outside of Cindy's house that night when the fire occurred. Some of the detectives accused her family and friends of covering up for her. One person who provided input was Cindy's former psychiatrist, and they said that Cindy suffered from borderline personality disorder and PTSD. By other psychiatrists who had treated Cindy over the years, they had believed that she suffered with anxiety disorder, major depressive disorder, paranoid disorder, psychotic delusions, and also suicidal ideation. Note in her journal when she was staying at the psychiatric unit, said, "I still feel suicide is my best option in an unbearable situation. And as soon as I get out of here, I will carry out my plan." So this is a very, upsetting case where, Cindy is obviously very troubled. She, was allowed to go home after her stay at the psychiatric unit without having like a plan set in place or even like a real diagnosis of what was going on with her. So there is a lot of speculation on whether, did she have a stalker and then end up committing suicide? Was she finally killed by her stalker? There's a lot of unanswered questions there. And at the end, the jury was unable to decide for certain whether she had been murdered or if she had committed suicide. And, one vote actually changed the decision from suicide to undetermined. And also some people brought up how, Cindy knew much more about the person who was doing these attacks than she let on. She was always very tight-lipped about, identifying features or like providing a lot of detail or insight into what was going on. She was very private, but often people would point out that Cindy was terrorized. Like, it was clear that she was greatly distressed by everything going on with her. And, she's a victim whether she did this herself or if this was done to her. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Her family still believes that someone had killed her and are still adamant about finding justice for her. It's just a devastating case any way you look at it. Mm-hmm. And it's just, there's no real conclusion here. I do think that Cindy was a very troubled soul, and I hope she has found peace. And I hope her family finds peace eventually as well, because this is just a devastating thing for everyone involved. Anything to add?
Great job, Ris. Great case. Very thought-provoking and wonderful that you did a great job presenting everything.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to call it. The time is 21:03. That's 9:03 for all of you who do not use military time.
Tonight's case took forever, but Ris powered through.
I did eventually, even though I'm very tired.
And cranky.